Hello and welcome to this video. In this video I'm going to be looking at constructing a Hardy's Hobbies 3D printed kit of a Hudswell Clarke 1800 class loco, which I plan to finish as the Nene Valley Railway's very own Thomas. That is a particular loco that I've always wanted a model of. So let's have a look at what you get inside the box. First up is a 3D printed body shell of the iconic Hudswell Clarke 1800 class, although one of the buffers has broken off in transit. The brittleness of the plastic will prove to be a major problem during this build, but we'll come to that later on. The buffer is a simple case of just reattaching with some super glue. So I'll put it in the box there for safekeeping. We've also got a 3D printed roof there. In this bit of bubble wrap we've got the driver, the boiler back head and all other little sundry items to detail the body shell up with. We've also got some couplings, NEM couplings, some handrails, some handrail wire, a smoke box door dart. Basically everything we need to get this locomotive running apart from a chassis. I'm going to put all the stuff here in a plastic tub so I don't lose any parts. And then we're going to look at the donor loco, which is going to provide a chassis for this model. As you can see by the ticks there, I've been through the instruction sheet to make sure that everything's present. Now the chassis I'm going to use is off an Electrotren NCB industrial tank loco. Indeed, this body kit is designed to fit onto this chassis. So I found one of these on Facebook Marketplace quite cheaply. You can pick them up for around £50 to £60. And as luck would have it, this one is actually DCC ready with a 6-pin interface, which will save a lot of hassle later on. So let's have a look at this tiny little model before we disassemble it. These are quite nice little models, ideal for starters considering they're DCC ready as well. And the chassis and wheelbase there looks to be good, and so does the cylinders for this Hudswell Clarke industrial steam engine. Decoration and detail is very basic on the model. The printed livery is quite nice, but the decoration is a little bit flat, to be honest. So I'm going to disassemble this now, and I'm going to keep the body shell and put that in my spares box. Who knows, maybe one day we'll find a use for it. Just sizing it up there, the chassis against the 3D printed body. It does look like it might be a nice fit. Now I'm just going to put the loco on the test track here and give it a quick battery test just to make sure everything's working, as it's no good starting a project with a dead chassis. And this seems to be running quite nicely. There's no issues on that front. So to remove the body from the chassis, it's just a simple case of removing these two screws. There is a longer screw in the front here. As you'll see later in the build, this longer screw comes in very handy. And after the screws are undone, you just lift it out. The DCC interface is there. And it's a very small motor. But then it is quite a small engine, so it's not going to be designed to pull a great deal of stuff. And like I said, this body shell I'll keep and put in my spares box. Now I'm just going to offer the chassis up here to the 3D printed body shell just to make sure everything's okay. And that interface floating about there caused a few issues. But it fits snugly on the body there. The cylinders aren't as high up as I'd like, but we live with what we can. This isn't going to be an exact replica, or more of a representation of the loco I want to model. But everything seems to fit all right, and it looks quite nice. Now that we've done that, what I'm going to do is I've got to strip down this even further. So I'm going to remove the chassis keeper plate to remove the wheels. And I'm also going to remove the side rods, as these will all need painting in the future. Just giving it a quick test run here with the body shell on. And you'll see it's quite jerky. Now this was a problem that was inherent with the body shell, but we'll come back to this later on. So yeah, initially my first thoughts are I'm really pleased with this. I can't wait to get cracking on it, as Thomas is a loco that I've wanted on my railway for many years. Being the local Thomas the Tank engine on the preserved line, it's a loco I've looked at and admired, and having a bit of a interest for industrial locos, a Hudswell Clarke 1800 is something I've always wanted. So now, following the instructions, the first thing we've got to do is get this tiny drill bit, and we've got to drill out all the handrail holes as per the instructions on the side tanks, on the cab and on the smoke box side there, and also drill out the hole for the smoke box door dart. Once this is all done, the handrails are made up and put into place. The plastic, like I said, is very brittle, but it is easily drilled through, so go steady if you decide to build this kit yourself. So moving on slightly now, what I'm going to do is just get this flat file and rub down all the 3D printing pips that are left over, as it was quite bumpy, so I'm just going to file this all smooth. It may be worth wearing a mask doing this, as the dust is nasty stuff. You don't want to get that in your lungs. And now we're going to look at bending up the brass wire that's supplied with the kit to make the handrails. The first to go on are the cab handrails, and you just bend them into an L shape there, and they fit into the pre-drilled holes, and everything in this build was secured with a small amount of Loctite superglue, as I found that the best medium to work with this plastic. So I'm going to skip ahead now, and here we are with all the handrails and the smoke box door dart done. Everything is supplied with the kit, the handrail knobs and the brass and the smoke box door dart, like I said. The handrail around the front there was quite tricky because you have to bend it to shape, but overall I'm happy with how this is turning out. The brass handrails already start to set this model off quite nicely. Now it's time to add some of the other 3D printed details, and we start with these water filler caps. You do get a spare one, but go gently cutting them off the sprue, as you don't want to break them. And like I said, these are fixed in place with some Loctite superglue gel, and this really was the best medium. I didn't want to use plastic weld, as that was too aggressive and I didn't want to damage the plastic. These kits retail at £45, and then you've got to buy the paint and the chassis. So you're looking at probably just over £100 for this, if it was ready to run. But if you do a good job of it, it is well worth the effort. As you can see there's some springs also that need putting on this model, so I just snap them off there using my tweezer nose pliers, as the printing pips are quite weak. And I leave the other details on the sprue so that I don't lose any. These were quite tricky to fit, these springs, as they go in the hole between the running plate and the water tank. And so what I did was I used a small amount of super glue inside the hole there, and then just held them in place with the tweezer nose pliers until the glue had set. Once the glue had set, I just, well, here I am putting the glue on the actual spring itself. Just a small amount, you don't need a lot. The super glue really does set rock hard on this plastic. And then once they've been put in place and the super glue was left to dry, I decanted some super glue out onto a piece of plastic and just reinforced the joints with some super glue on the end of a cocktail stick, just to ensure a very solid join, as I don't want these parts breaking off or falling off in the future. So you can see there a tiny amount of super glue on that cocktail stick just to glue the springs in place. The same was repeated on the other side, as there's also a spring underneath the water tank on the opposite side. The detail on this model is quite good already. I really do like the look of this. I can't wait to see it finished. So now what I'm going to do is, I mentioned earlier on that chassis wouldn't run properly with the body shell on, and it's because the middle steps here are they're set too far in, so that the crank pin in the middle wheel catches them and locks it up. So what I've done is I'm actually cutting them off the model, and I'm going to reattach them further out. It doesn't look too bad when running around, you can't really notice it, but the chassis I bought, even though the instructions said to use a Electrotren chassis, it was the steps were too narrow to accommodate easy running. You could also just see there that I've used a bit of filler to just hide some of the mould holes and some sink in the plastic. I'm going to leave the whistle and safety valve gear off until after painting, as that is quite fragile. Now, whilst I was doing this, I found this old Ertl Fat controller that I used to have when I was a kid, and he looked a bit forlorn. He will do if I keep dropping him, but he looked a bit forlorn with all his paint chipped, and he just didn't look very nice. So I'm going to restore him as well during the course of this video. On the real Thomas at Knee Valley Railway, there's a Westinghouse pump on one side of the smoke box that powers the air brakes on this loco to allow it to work with the European stock that is on the Nene Valley. I could have bought a white metal part, but I decided to make my own. So putting this old piece of kit sprue into my Dremel here and tightening the chuck up, what I did was I held a small needle file in the vise, spun the Dremel around so it was going, and then filed some grooves in this plastic tube to make my own Westinghouse pump. This also reduces costs and reduces waste, as I keep some parts of kit sprues. And as you'll see in a minute, I'm just going to file the end flat there. It doesn't look too bad of a representation of a Westinghouse pump. I hope you'll agree that looks quite good, and once it's painted and had pipes added, I'm hoping that it will look the part. If not, I'll have to plumb and buy a white metal part off the internet. Now that the body shell has been primed with Halford's white primer, I'm just giving it the once over here to make sure there's no obvious errors, and all looks good at the moment. So I'm going to be painting it in this Tamiya blue paint. I believe it's X1, I think. And this Ammo MIG blue is almost an exact colour match for touching up any chips on the wheels, etc. Here is the model after the first coat of blue, and it really is starting to look nice. I like the depth of colour on this blue. So Thomas is now making strides, and then you'll see him hanging here now after his second coat of blue. So while this paint's drying, let's have a look at the real Thomas. Thomas was built in 1947 for the British Sugar Corporation and spent its entire working life at the Woodston Works in Peterborough. After the diesels arrived in the late 60s, it was still maintained in very good order, and it was nicknamed Thomas because of his eye-catching blue livery. The Peterborough Railway Society, which later became the Nene Valley Railway, bought the locomotive for £100, and it was present at Peterborough Railway Society open days and then moved to the Nene Valley's headquarters in Wansford. This Gordon Edgar picture you can see here proves that Thomas did actually have lining on him, and this was taken around 1972. This photograph that dates from 1971 shows the Reverend Wilbur Awdry, author of the Railway Series books, actually naming Thomas at a Peterborough Railway Society open day, and as such it remains the only genuinely named Wilbur Awdry Thomas in the world. Here we see Thomas in its current condition as of 2022, halfway through a boiler overhaul, and I took these images of it on the turntable in the summer of 2022. Thomas should be back out on the rails in the Nene Valley in next year. Here we now see the loco after the blue paint had dried and I'd done the detail painting and the buffer beams, and it really is starting to look very nice. Here we see Thomas after his 2016 overhaul, and you can see the smart blue livery, although in this image it does look a lot lighter than the blue I've used. The livery application on this loco is very simple. Red buffer beams, black running boards and blue all over. The coal rail at the back of the bunker is also black, and initially I missed this off, but we rectify that later on. I also masked up and painted the Electrotren wheels a light blue and painted the coupling rods and piston rods red. This Hudswell Clarke industrial shunter looks the business, and it really is a nice model. Indeed, it is a nice loco in real life. It is powerful and workmanship-like. If you're local to the Nene Valley, head down there in 2023 and hopefully Thomas will be back in steam. Now let's turn our attention to this fat controller figure before we get back to the model. Now he is looking quite forlorn and is really badly chipped. So it's time for a bath for you, Sir Topham Hatt. I'm going to put him in my glass jar. I hope he's got some soap and shampoo with him. I'm going to plop him in this glass jar. Just gently drop him in the bottom there. Stand him up and then fill the glass jar half with boiling water. Once he's submerged in the boiling water, I'm going to add the caustic soda granules, and this should remove all of the paint off this die-cast fat controller. You can see the reaction there, and I've done this before in Trash to Track when we did a breakdown crane up. This reaction of the caustic soda and boiling water will remove the paint from this die-cast item. You can see there that the water is fizzing away around the fat controller, and the flakes of black paint are already starting to come off and float around the jar. If we just have a close-up there, you can see him fizzing away whilst it removes all that black paint. Now that all the paint's been removed from the Fat Controller, we'll have a look at the die casting here, and there is quite a lot of detail on this. He's got a pocket handkerchief, buttons on his waistcoat, and there's even a shirt and tie underneath his chin. There's a couple of mould lines on the side, but I'm not too fussed. Thomas was also thoroughly dried and had a gloss coat ready for his transfers, and this model really is starting to look nice now in this livery. The cab has also been painted cream. Now I've had some custom nameplates made as well, as the Hudswell Clarke Thomas has got nameplates, as we just saw, and was named by the Rev W Awdry himself. So these will need painting as well. I'm going to prime the Fat Controller now with Halford's Grey Primer, and whilst he dries, I've set myself up now to have a look at putting some transfers on Thomas, as the Thomas at the Knee Valley is fully lined out with red lining. So I'm going to use this red lining sheet that I got from Railtech, which comes with various corners and long lengths of red lining, so there should be plenty here. The nameplates have also been primed and they've been painted red with a Humbrol acrylic aerosol, and once that's dry they'll be polished off with them 1200 grit wet and dry. The number 1 for Thomas I'm going to use off this old LMS transfer sheet, as that's the only one I could find that looked anywhere near it. And here we have old Sir Topham Hatt in his base coat of grey primer, although it did go slightly funny on the back of his legs there, so I'll have to redo that bit before I finish him off by hand painting him. Right, now Thomas is laid on its side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut some of the transfers to length and submerge them in this water that's lukewarm and had a drop of washing up liquid in it. I'm going to dampen the body side there with a cotton bud, and then with a cocktail stick gently pull the lining off the backing paper after it's been soaked for about a minute and a half. You have to work steadily when doing lining to ensure that it is all level. I sometimes do it by eye, but I wanted to make a good job of this Thomas, so I end up using a straight edge as well. Doing the tank sides was actually quite complex, as you have to do the corners around that gap where the spring sits. So just manipulating the transfer here with a cocktail stick, I'm just going to try and get it as level as I can before checking with a straight edge. You have to be gentle doing this, as you don't want to knock the transfer with the metal ruler, as you could tear the transfer. That looks straight enough for me, so I'm happy with that at the moment. I'm just going to adjust that corner there, and then I'm going to carry on doing it. But to save the viewers time, as it did take a long time to line Thomas out, I'm going to skip ahead now until I've fully lined one tank side, and I've also lined the bunk around the back. Now that really is starting to look the part. I've also added some red lining on the boiler bands. I'm not sure if the real Thomas has this, but it really does look quite nice. So I'm going to now finish off the other side. And believe me, you didn't miss anything with me not filming during the transfers, as it did take an awfully long time. In fact, this whole build from start to finish took me about 4 months. So now Thomas has been fully lined out and has had a coat of satin varnish. You can see there the number 1s are in place, and I've also put the safety valve and whistle in place. So now we're going to have a look at the wheels, which I masked up and painted. However, on this occasion, on one of the wheels, the masking left a lot to be desired, as it coated the entire back of one of the wheels. Now this isn't very good. The coupling rods here have also been painted red with a Humbrol rattle can. So as I was saying, the back of the wheel isn't very good, as this is what we need to conduct electricity from the track to the actual motor. So using a fiberglass pencil, I'm going to polish up all the wheel backs and the wheel treads, and then obviously with my usual method of methylated spirits and a cotton bud, clean all the residue off, just to make sure that the wheel backs and the wheel treads are crystal clean, ready for when we reassemble the model, and that will aid, hopefully, in some good running. Now the wheels are back in the chassis, I'm going to be putting the side rods back on, and these are just put in place with the representation of the oil box facing towards the rear. They simply sit on the crank pins there, and then using my hex nut tool I tighten up the crank pins and put them all back in place. There is this plastic washer that also sits on the middle crank pin, just to push the piston rod away from the wheel slightly and keep everything in alignment. If you decide to do this, or indeed any work on chassis like this, be patient and don't try and rush it, as one simple kink in any of these metal parts will result in the loco's erratic running or not running at all. So by putting the crank pin in the hex nut driver there, just gently turning it until the thread on the screw grips, and then you can tighten it up as far as it will go. This was repeated on all the other 5 crank pins, and on the opposite side the crank pins were put back on as well. Now that everything's been put back together, giving it a quick test there with the battery on the wheels, proves that all the wheels are picking up, so we can move on to the next stage of the build. Before I do that, however, I'm going to put some lubrication on the model, as a lot of it was removed with masking and handling. So the silicone grease was put on the worm gear, followed by a small drop of oil. This model is going to be used on the garden railway, but it needs to be well lubricated so that the parts don't wear out. I'll just give it another test there with the battery, just to spread the lubrication through the drivetrain. Right, now what we're going to do is we're going to start fitting the details that I've painted off the 3D printed sprue. Now that the boiler back head has all been done, again as before, I use a small flat file just to file it nice and smooth. And you'll notice there is the lug out of the bottom of the smoke box, and that fits on a small lug inside the cab, just so it helps with alignment. This was fitted with a small amount of Loctite super glue. So I just put a small dab on the back of the smoke box there, or back of the fire hole door, should I say. Put that in the cab, and then I press it home with finger pressure, and then leave it to set. Once that's set, what I do is I'm going to decant some of the super glue onto a plastic container there, and just dip the driver and fireman's feet in it, and then stand them both in the cab. These are all primed and painted off screen, as it would have been quite boring watching me paint these for hours on end. The fireman there having his feet dunked in the super glue, and like I said, this super glue really does glue hard to this plastic, so there's no danger of them going anywhere. Once that's all dry, we're going to have a look at this Westinghouse pump that I made. I got this old body shell of a standard from the local model shop with the view of robbing all these pipes off the side. I thought they could come in handy for pipe work on the side of Thomas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to strip that down off camera, again to save you time as it's quite boring. And here we have the pipe assemblies off that standard body. Now I've got these because if you, I'll just put the body shell down there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, like I said, look through these for some detail for the Westinghouse pump. Some of these valves and that look like they might fit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the Westinghouse pump off its sprue. And then I've got these pictures I've printed offline for looking at the pipe work detail. So there's a pipe there that goes in behind the water tank, and there's this one that goes down the front to the brake pipes on the front of the buffer beam. So that's what I got the pipe work for. I've also missed this part here, so I've got to touch that in with red as well, as at the moment I've not painted that bit. And having a look at this one as well, just a couple of close-up pictures here, you can see that that box in front of the tank was black on that picture, and this box I've got in my hand is blue. It does seem that on various times in Thomas's lifetime these were either black or blue, so it doesn't really matter. I opted for blue as I think it looks smarter. And also you can see that the lining on is different. That one is different to the bottom one. So Thomas has had various liveries during his lifetime. Even though the main livery's been blue, there's been variations in his detail painting and his lining. These boxes, I think they're sand boxes, I stand to be corrected, but these again were glued to the chassis running plate with a small amount of Loctite adhesive, and then held in place with my needle nose pliers, and there's one on each side of the model to be put on. I put these on first before the Westinghouse pump, as the Westinghouse pump sits in front of these on the real loco. So I'm just holding them in place there until the glue sets. I really am liking how this model is coming on. So to separate the pump that I scratch built, I'm just going to run my scalpel with a fresh blade, run it over the sprue there just to cut through it. And once it's off the sprue, I'm going to attach this to the body side, to the chassis running plate at the side of the smoke box, again using a small amount of super glue. Once that's glued in place, I'm going to look at adding some of that additional pipework detail. The super glue sets really quick on this plastic, as I've said before. Right, so what I'm going to do now I'm just going to drill a hole, now the glue is set, in the top of the pump for one of these valves to sit in. So using my pin chuck and a 0.5mm drill bit, just give it a few turns in the top there just to make an indentation for the detail parts to sit in. I also drill a hole through the top of the buffer beam on the running plate there for the pipe to sit through, so it all sits secure. And this was held in place again with a small amount of super glue. The plastic on this model body shell, as I mentioned earlier, is extremely brittle, so you have to be careful. In my opinion, it really lets the kit down a bit, and I think it would be better if it was printed in a more high quality plastic or even resin. But there we go, that's the pipe sticking down the front there, as we saw in the photograph earlier. And now I'm going to drill another hole through the water tank side for the pipe to go through that we saw that went behind the water tank. Putting it inside the water tank here gives the glue something to hold on to, and it holds it all nice and secure. So I'm just going to thread that in there, when I can get it to line up, that is. But when this was all in place, I left it for a couple of hours for the super glue to fully cure before we moved on to the next part, which was painting the pump and associated pipework. So here we are a bit later, and you can see there that it is starting to look the part now. I really like that, and I'm glad I plumbed for building my own instead of buying a white metal cast one off the internet. I'm also going to touch in this black paint that I said I missed off earlier, especially around the coal bunker and where it's rubbed off on the running board. So using a small brush, I'm just going to touch in the pipework here, as I don't want Thomas to have any weathering on him at all, because the real Thomas is kept in pristine condition if you've ever seen him. So I'm just putting the paint on here, like I said, and this really does tie it all in nicely. On the opposite side of the smoke box are some lubrication and oil runs, but I decided not to put these on. One, due to time constraints, and two, I just didn't have anything that represented them. So if I find something in the future, maybe a donor part of another model, I might just add it on with a small amount of glue. So you can see I'm just painting that pipe there, which I assume is a vacuum pipe for the brake pipes on the front. And then I go around and touch in all the black paint off the sides, especially here underneath the number 1, because for some reason that part there either got rubbed off or missed when I painted it during the detail painting stage. And I'm also going to paint this rail across the top of the bunker. As on the real one, as we saw in the proper footage earlier on, the real one is black. The red I used on the buffer beams was just normal Humbrol acrylic red. Right, now we're going to look at DCC fitting the chassis. Now, it was DCC ready. However, when I put a 6-pin decoder in the harness, the body shell would not fit on. The DCC decoder was simply too tall. So I've cut that all off, and I'm going to use these adapters that are available from Bachmann. And the reason behind this is with the 6-pin decoder, it can fit in the hole inside the body shell, inside the water tanks. So I'm going to solder these in place, red and black to track for the pickups and orange and grey to the motor terminals. Now that that's all done, and the exposed wire has had some heat shrink tubing over it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the DCC chip and the adapter inside the water tank there, and then run the wire channel around that front pillar where the bolt goes to screw the loco back to the chassis. Once I finally reassemble this, I'll tidy the wires up, like I said, and tuck them all in there quite neatly. In the other water tank there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some lead weight, as the loco is quite light. So I've got a small amount of lead flashing, and I'm going to cut some up and glue it into the side there, just to give the loco a bit of extra weight. So here we are reassembling the chassis into the body shell, and you can see the weight in there that I've added. And the 2 bolts that's provided with the model are glued into the holders. However, this is where we started to run into the problems with this model. So I attempted to screw the chassis onto the body shell using the nuts and bolts provided. And initially it was going well until I tried to tighten it up just gently enough to pull the body shell down, when I noticed that there was no more resistance. And what happened was that the plastic inside the model, which holds the bolt in place, had gone extremely brittle. And you can see there that the chassis isn't sitting level, so I'm scratching my head thinking, well, this should be in nicely. So I pushed the front of the chassis down, and then you'll see then when I zoom into it, that piece there has broken. The plastic is too brittle to have the tension of the screw in it. So now I'm really scratching my head thinking, how on earth am I going to attach the chassis to this body? But upon investigation, this photograph I took earlier on, the body shell isn't actually level. It goes up towards the back. So it's an error in printing, I believe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this screw from the chassis that holds the chassis keeper plate in. I've drilled through the chassis into where the firebox detail is, and I'm going to pass the screw through there. And this actually worked reasonably well, because if I drilled the hole the same width as the screw, it threaded itself. So now we're on to final detailing now, and I've got a pot of real coal here out of the bottom of my coal scuttle. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue some into the cab, as at where the bunker is, there is a hole for the coal to fall through in the actual cab. So using a piece of card, I just tip a tiny amount down into the cab floor, and then manipulate it with a cocktail stick and a screwdriver, and then fasten it in place with a few dollops of rocket card glue. Once the glue had been put down onto the cab floor, again I just pushed any stray pieces of coal back into place and allowed it to dry thoroughly. Now it was time to put coal into the bunker, and to do this I simply put a fair bit of glue into the bunker itself. So there's a fair bit of rocket card glue going in there. And then using some fine bits of real coal, as I said, I got off the coal scuttle. Just going to wipe away any excess glue. I gently tip some in using this plastic tub, and then just shovel it in with the end of the scalpel blade, just so that it falls into the glue and fills the bunker up. Once that's done and it starts sinking into the glue, I'm just going to manipulate it and tamp it down there with the end of a cocktail stick. I get a paintbrush and put a few drops of water onto the coal just to moisten it, much like you would do if you were laying ballast on your model railway. So I drop some water on it, again manipulate any wayward parts with a cocktail stick, and then drop a little bit more glue on it, just so that the bunker is nice and secure and all the coal is in there and won't fall out. And then once that's done, I get a very small amount of very fine real coal. This is just powder that's come through a sieve, just to put it on the top there, just to seal it all in nicely. Now Thomas has got plenty of fuel for any further journeys. Now it comes to the cab roof. This only goes on one way with the vent above the driver and fireman. And I'm going to run a small bead of super glue again around the top of the cab there. And there is only the slightest bit of super glue coming out of this pot. I'm not going to overdo this. And then once that's on, I'm just going to put the cab roof on and hold it in place with finger pressure for about 2 minutes until the glue is firmly set and the cab roof is in place and at the correct profile. Now that that's all done, we're going to have to start looking at the front of the loco, the brake pipes and the face. I've got some of these Helgen sprues, and I'm going to cut the vacuum and air pipes off these and use these. So I just release these from the sprue with a sharp scalpel, and then using a 0.5mm drill bit, I drill the holes in the relevant positions in the front and rear buffer beams. Once that's done, again, a small amount of super glue was used to secure these in place. There are 3 pipes on the front and 3 pipes on the rear. So there's the vacuum pipe hanging down there, and you can see the NEN coupling pocket there. So like I said, these were all fitted with super glue, and then a Romford Models coupling hook was also inserted, as the one supplied with the model was too small for the hole. So now it really is starting to look the part, and the NEM coupling pocket has been fitted as well. The steps were still a problem, so what I've done is I've cut them down to half the size, just to allow the crank pin to turn around freely and let the model run. Now the face, I thought I was going to have big trouble with this, but as it happens, I found a couple of head-on pictures online, and my friend Lewis also sent me a couple, and I printed them out on high quality photo paper at 15% normal size, and I cut them out very carefully with scissors and mounted a wire hook on the back so that the hook sits on the top handrail, as you can see here. This was again fastened on with super glue, and once it had fully dried, I just simply hooked the tiny piece of brass over the handrail at the front of the model, and then the loco has his face. It doesn't sit exactly flush with the model because of the smokebox door dart, but I can live with that, as I didn't want Thomas to have a permanent face all the time. I wanted it to be removable. And as you can see here, it really is starting to look the part, and I am loving this way this build has gone. And I did two different types of face, although they are both the same expression. That one is just slightly smaller. And then you've got this one, which I think is the one I prefer, as it's quite darker and does mimic the real one quite well. So I'll just move my thumb there, and you'll see that Thomas has now got his cheeky face. This model really is a pleasure to build, and it is a shame that the plastic is so brittle and that the body shell is slightly warped. But now one of the last things to do is to apply the nameplates what we've had custom made for Thomas. These have been polished up so that the lettering and edging are all exposed, and I apply these to the body shell with a small amount of satin varnish. I simply put some on the body side, drop the nameplate on and manipulate it straight with a cocktail stick. Mop away any excess varnish with a damp cotton bud, and once it's dry it secures the nameplate in place, and because the model's got a coat of satin varnish on it anyway, it is an invisible join where glue could mark the body side and that nice paint job that I've done. So now Thomas really is starting to look complete. But what has happened to the Fat Controller, I wonder? We haven't seen him in a while. Where on earth has he got to, Thomas? Well, I'll tell you. Thomas is now done and complete, and so is the Fat Controller. Hand painted, and he took a couple of days to do. In this shot here, all he's doing is waiting for a nice gloss coat of varnish to be applied. And then he'll sit on my bookcase, pride of place, and he'll preside over many Trash to Track episodes in the future, I'm sure. So I'm really pleased with how this has turned out. It's a model of an engine that I've always wanted. I've restored a childhood toy and got a model of a Hudswell Clarke industrial engine as Thomas. And I'll leave you now with some shots of Thomas running around the layout, hauling 3 Mark I coaches, which is what this chassis seems to be its maximum limit. And I'd like to thank you all for watching this kit build of a Hardy's Hobbies Hudswell Clarke 1800 class. I'd also like to thank Upside Now for the extremely awesome Thomas Re-orchestrated music that you've heard in this video, and also a couple of guys that allowed me to use their footage of Thomas. They're all credited in the links below in the comments, as are links to their channels, so please go and check them out. I would greatly appreciate it. So from me, Thomas and the Fat Controller, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye for now.